The idea that the United States could simply bomb Iran, trigger the collapse of the government, and watch a new regime rise from the ashes sounds dramatic, powerful, and almost cinematic. It fits the modern narrative of high-tech warfare where precision missiles, stealth aircraft, and satellite intelligence supposedly allow powerful nations to reshape the world from the sky. But if you step back and look at history for even a moment, the illusion begins to crack. Because there is a rule that appears again and again across centuries of warfare, and once you see it, it becomes impossible to ignore. No regime in modern history has ever been removed by air power alone. Not once. Every successful regime change required something much more brutal and much more politically unpopular. Soldiers physically occupying the capital and removing the leadership themselves. The moment you understand that rule, the entire conversation about Iran starts to look very different, because the strategy most people imagine simply doesn't exist in the real world. The belief that technology has changed this rule is incredibly powerful, but it's also deeply misleading. For decades, military leaders and politicians have promoted the idea that modern weapons allow wars to be fought surgically. Precision bombs, guided missiles, drones, satellite targeting systems, all of it creates the impression that governments can be removed with minimal risk and minimal cost. This narrative is comforting because the alternative is ugly. Ground invasions are expensive. They produce casualties. They drag on for years and sometimes decades. Democracies hate them because voters hate them. So a new story replaced the old one, that technology changed war forever. But the deeper military history studies go, the more uncomfortable the conclusion becomes. Technology rarely decides wars on its own. Strategy, endurance, economics, and political will matter far more. And once you start looking at conflicts through that lens, something strange begins to appear. The side with the most advanced technology often becomes the more vulnerable side. That sounds counterintuitive at first, but the reason becomes obvious when you examine the economics of modern warfare. Advanced weapons are incredibly expensive. A single interceptor missile can cost between $1 and $3 million. Now imagine a scenario where an incoming missile costs only $100,000. Suddenly, the defending country has to spend 10, 20, or even 30 times more money just to try to stop the attack. And sometimes those interceptors miss anyway. There was recently an incident where multiple interceptors were fired at a single incoming missile, and even with that enormous expense, the interception failed. This is the economic trap of asymmetric warfare. The weaker side spends a small amount of money to force the stronger side to spend a massive amount trying to defend itself. Scale that situation up to hundreds or thousands of missiles, and the numbers become staggering. 1,000 cheap missiles could force the defending side to spend tens of billions of dollars attempting to intercept them. Suddenly, the war stops being about who has better technology and becomes a question of who can afford to keep playing the game longer. This is exactly the type of conflict Iran has been preparing for over the last 2 decades. Ever since the early 2000s, when the United States labeled Iran part of the axis of evil, Iranian leadership assumed that a confrontation with America was not just possible, but inevitable. From that moment on, their strategy shifted toward preparing for a war against a much stronger opponent. But instead of trying to match American military power directly, Iran studied how weaker powers defeat stronger ones. They looked at Vietnam, where the United States possessed overwhelming technological superiority but still failed to achieve its objectives. They studied Afghanistan, where a superpower spent 20 years fighting an insurgency that refused to collapse. They examined Iraq, where the initial military victory was quick and decisive, but was followed by decades of instability and insurgency. The lesson Iran drew from these conflicts was simple but profound. Powerful countries lose wars not because they are weak, but because their strengths make them predictable. When a country invests billions into advanced weapons systems, it cannot afford to lose those systems. Every aircraft carrier represents billions of dollars. Every stealth fighter represents enormous investment. Every advanced missile system represents years of research and development. Losing these assets becomes politically unacceptable, which forces the stronger side to become cautious and risk-averse. Meanwhile, the weaker side operates under completely different rules. Their weapons are cheaper. Their strategies rely on endurance instead of perfection. and their forces can absorb losses that would be politically catastrophic for a wealthy democracy. This creates a paradox where the richer and more technologically advanced military begins to move carefully while the weaker side becomes unpredictable and aggressive. The war stops being about power and starts becoming about patience. But Iran's strategy goes far beyond missile economics or asymmetric tactics. The real battlefield may not even be Iran itself. Instead, the critical pressure points lie across the Persian Gulf in the wealthy states that form the Gulf Cooperation Council: Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Bahrain. These countries sit at the center of the global energy system. They sell oil to the world, receive payment in US dollars, and then reinvest those dollars into American financial markets, technology projects, and real estate. This recycling of oil money back into the United States helped create what economists call the petrodollar system. For decades, it has quietly supported the American financial structure and helped maintain the global dominance of the dollar. But every system has vulnerabilities, and Iran has spent years studying exactly where those vulnerabilities lie. One of the most surprising weaknesses of the Gulf states has nothing to do with oil or military strength. It has to do with water. Many of the massive cities in the Gulf region depend on desalination plants to survive. These facilities convert seawater into drinking water for millions of people. Without them, entire metropolitan regions would face water shortages within days and potentially complete depletion within weeks. Destroy a handful of these plants, and the consequences could be catastrophic. Cities with populations of 10 million people could suddenly face the reality that their drinking water supply is disappearing. In a modern war, where infrastructure becomes the primary target, water facilities become strategic assets just as important as military bases or oil fields. This shift toward infrastructure warfare represents a fundamental change in how conflicts are fought. Instead of focusing only on destroying armies, modern asymmetric strategies target the systems that allow societies to function. Energy grids, financial networks, ports, pipelines, and water systems become pressure points that can destabilize entire regions without requiring traditional battlefield victories. If Iran were able to severely damage critical infrastructure across the Gulf, the economic shockwaves could ripple through global markets, disrupt oil supply chains, and threaten the financial flows that support Western economies. In other words, the battlefield would extend far beyond Iran's borders. Another concept that plays a huge role in these discussions is something called shock and awe. The theory behind shock and awe is that overwhelming force at the very beginning of a conflict will psychologically break enemy. Massive bombing campaigns, rapid military advances, and devastating strikes are supposed to create such fear and confusion that the opposing government collapses before the war even fully begins. The idea gained enormous attention during the 2003 invasion of Iraq, when American forces launched a huge air campaign designed to cripple the Iraqi government immediately. For a moment, it appeared to work. Iraqi forces collapsed quickly, statues of Saddam Hussein were pulled down, and many observers declared the war finished. But the real story began after that moment. What followed the initial invasion was not stability or regime consolidation, but years of insurgency, political chaos, and prolonged conflict. The Iraqi government had fallen, but the war had not ended. Instead, the battlefield transformed into something far more complex and far more difficult to control. Militias emerged, insurgent groups formed, and the occupation stretched on for years. The initial display of overwhelming force had not produced a quick victory. It had only triggered the next phase of the conflict. Iran has studied that example carefully. Instead of concentrating military assets in obvious locations where they could be destroyed by airstrikes, Iranian forces have spent years dispersing their capabilities across hidden facilities, underground tunnels, decentralized command networks, and proxy groups operating across the region. The goal is simple: absorb the initial shock of an attack and then respond asymmetrically. Instead of fighting a conventional battle that could be quickly lost, the strategy focuses on endurance and retaliation through indirect means. Missile attacks, proxy forces, cyber operations, and economic disruption become tools to gradually bleed a stronger opponent over time. This approach also relies heavily on psychology. When populations feel attacked from outside forces, internal political divisions often shrink dramatically. Even citizens who dislike their government may rally around it when faced with an external threat. National identity and survival instincts take precedence over internal disagreements. Throughout history, this phenomenon has repeated itself again and again. External pressure tends to strengthen regimes rather than weaken them, at least in the short term. Bombing campaigns that were meant to trigger uprisings instead end up reinforcing the government's legitimacy as the defender of the nation. So when analysts talk about the possibility of regime change in Iran through airstrikes or economic pressure alone, they are often ignoring these deeper patterns. Sanctions have already been imposed on Iran for decades, and the country has adapted to them by building alternative economic networks and partnerships with other major powers. Military strikes may damage infrastructure or military facilities, but they are unlikely to collapse the political system overnight. Instead, they can produce exactly the opposite effect by strengthening national unity and prolonging resistance. This leads to a deeply uncomfortable conclusion. If regime change truly were the goal, then history suggests there is only one method that consistently works: ground invasion and occupation. That means physically capturing the capital, removing the leadership, and installing a new government backed by military force. This is how Germany and Japan were transformed after World War II. It is how Iraq's government was removed in 2003. Every example follows the same pattern. Air power can weaken a regime, but it cannot replace it. But this raises a terrifying question, because invading Iran would not look anything like invading Iraq in 2003. Iran is geographically enormous, filled with mountains that make military operations far more difficult. Its population is more than 3 times larger than Iraq's was at the time of the invasion. Its cities are dense, complex, and deeply interconnected. Urban warfare in a city the size of Tehran, which has nearly 9 million residents, would make previous conflicts look small by comparison. Casualties would be immense on all sides, and the war could stretch on for years or even decades. And yet, despite all of these obstacles, discussions about regime change continue to surface in political conversations. Which brings us to a strange and uncomfortable realization. Sometimes wars are not started because they are strategically wise. Sometimes they happen because they serve the interests of the leaders making the decisions. When you begin examining geopolitical conflicts through that lens, the motivations behind them start to look very different. Wars can consolidate political power, distract from domestic crises, unite populations behind leadership, and reshape political landscapes in ways that benefit those in charge. Understanding why wars happen therefore requires asking a different question than most people ask. Instead of asking whether a conflict benefits the country as a whole, it may be more revealing to ask whether it benefits the individuals making the decisions. History is filled with examples of leaders who initiated conflicts that were disastrous for their nations, but advantageous for their own power. And once you begin viewing geopolitical decisions through that framework, the motivations behind some modern conflicts become much harder to ignore. Because when leaders believe they are strong, when recent successes create a sense of invincibility, and when political incentives reward bold actions instead of cautious restraint, the stage becomes set for decisions that can reshape history in ways no one originally expected. And in the case of Iran, that story may only be beginning. The moment you accept that air power alone cannot remove a government, the conversation about Iran enters a completely different phase. Because if bombing cannot collapse the regime and sanctions have failed for 40 years, then only a handful of scenarios remain. And strangely, every single one of them leads to outcomes far more dangerous than the strategy people imagine when they casually talk about regime change. The first scenario is the most obvious and also the most terrifying: a full ground invasion. Throughout history, whenever a powerful country truly wanted to remove a regime, it eventually had to send soldiers to physically control the capital. Germany in 1945, Japan in 1945, Iraq in 2003, the pattern is always the same. Airstrikes weaken the state, but the final act requires troops entering the political center of power and removing the leadership themselves. Without that moment, the regime simply survives underground and waits for the war to shift. But the scale of what that would mean for Iran is almost impossible to exaggerate. Iran is not Iraq. Iraq's geography is mostly flat desert, which allows armored forces and aircraft to move quickly. Iran, by contrast, is dominated by mountains and narrow valleys that create natural defensive barriers. Military planners have known for centuries that mountainous terrain heavily favors defenders. Invading forces move slowly. Supply lines stretch dangerously thin, and defending units can strike from hidden positions again and again. Then there is the population factor. In 2003, Iraq had around 25 million people. Iran has more than 85 million. That difference changes everything. Even if a conventional invasion succeeded in defeating the Iranian military, the occupation phase would involve controlling a country more than 3 times larger in population and significantly larger in territory. Urban warfare in cities like Tehran, Mashhad, or Isfahan would make the battles of Fallujah or Mosul look small by comparison. And urban warfare has a brutal logic. Every street becomes a defensive line. Every apartment building becomes a potential fortress. Every civilian population becomes a complicated mixture of non-combatants and potential resistance fighters. History has repeatedly shown that large cities can absorb enormous amounts of military pressure without collapsing politically. The larger the city, the more difficult it becomes to control. But geography and population are only the beginning of the problem. The real danger appears when you zoom out and look at the broader geopolitical environment, because Iran would not be fighting alone. If a large-scale invasion began, other major powers would have powerful incentives to support the Iranian resistance indirectly. Russia and China might not send their own soldiers, but they could provide weapons, intelligence, financial assistance, and advanced technology. History has seen this pattern before. During the Cold War, the United States supported Afghan fighters against the Soviet Union, turning Afghanistan into a grinding war that drained Soviet resources for years. In a modern version of that scenario, Iran could become the battlefield of a prolonged proxy conflict between global powers. That kind of war rarely ends quickly. Instead, it slowly drains the resources of the invading power. Costs rise into the trillions. Casualties accumulate. Political divisions inside the invading country begin to grow. What started as a quick operation gradually becomes an endless commitment. And this is where the concept of asymmetric warfare returns with full force. Because the defending side does not need to win conventionally. It only needs to survive long enough for the political will of the attacker to collapse. Democracies are particularly vulnerable to this kind of pressure because public opinion eventually turns against prolonged wars that appear unwinnable. But there is another possible path that analysts sometimes discuss, and at first glance it sounds less catastrophic. Instead of invading Iran, the idea would be to collapse the Iranian economy first. The logic is straightforward. If sanctions and economic isolation become severe enough, the Iranian population might eventually turn against its own government. Internal protests could grow large enough to destabilize the regime, leading to political change without a foreign invasion. On paper, this strategy seems more humane and less risky. In reality, however, it faces a huge obstacle that is often overlooked. Iran has already lived under sanctions for decades. Over time, the country adapted to that pressure by building alternative trade networks, strengthening relationships with countries that oppose Western sanctions, and developing domestic industries designed to function under economic isolation. Sanctions can weaken economies, but they rarely produce the political collapse outsiders expect. In many cases, they produce the opposite effect. Governments facing external pressure often gain political legitimacy by presenting themselves as defenders of national sovereignty. Citizens who might normally criticize the government begin to see it as a shield against foreign domination. Nationalism becomes a powerful, unifying force. This psychological dynamic appears again and again in history. External threats tend to strengthen regimes internally, at least during the period of confrontation. People who might oppose their government during peaceful times often rally behind it when the nation itself feels under attack. Instead of weakening the leadership, outside pressure sometimes makes it more resilient. And that brings us to the final and perhaps most uncomfortable possibility. What if the goal of the conflict is not actually regime change at all? What if the war serves other purposes that have little to do with replacing the Iranian government? Throughout history, leaders have often used wars as tools to solve domestic political problems. Wars can unify divided populations, shift media attention away from internal crises, and allow governments to expand executive authority, under the justification of national security. Emergency powers become easier to justify during wartime, and opposition voices can be framed as unpatriotic or dangerous. This pattern is not unique to any one country or political system. It has appeared across centuries and across continents. Leaders sometimes pursue conflicts because those conflicts strengthen their personal political position, even if the long-term consequences for the country are uncertain or negative. Understanding this possibility forces us to rethink how geopolitical decisions are made. The question is not always whether a war benefits the nation as a whole. Sometimes, the more revealing question is whether it benefits the people making the decisions. When political incentives reward aggressive action, and when leaders feel pressure to demonstrate strength, the temptation to escalate conflicts can become very powerful. Even when advisors warn about long-term risks, the short-term political rewards may still drive decisions toward confrontation. And this is why the conversation about Iran is so complicated. The military reality suggests that regime change through bombing alone is almost impossible. The historical record shows that economic pressure rarely collapses entrenched governments. A ground invasion would be enormously costly and potentially destabilizing for the entire region. Yet, despite all of those obstacles, the idea continues to appear in political rhetoric and media discussion, which raises a deeper question about how nations understand power in the modern world. For centuries, empires believed that overwhelming military force could reshape entire regions. Sometimes it worked, particularly when the balance of power was overwhelmingly one-sided. But in the 21st century, the nature of conflict has changed. Information spreads instantly. Economies are interconnected across continents. Wars rarely remain confined to a single battlefield. Instead, they ripple outward through financial systems, energy markets, and international alliances. In this environment, asymmetric strategies become more effective because they target the complex systems that powerful nations depend on. A disruption in shipping lanes can shake global markets. Cyber attacks can destabilize financial networks. Infrastructure strikes can create humanitarian crises that reverberate far beyond the immediate battlefield. Modern warfare therefore looks less like the decisive battles of the past and more like a prolonged contest of endurance. And endurance favors the side that can absorb pressure without collapsing politically. Iran's entire strategic doctrine is built around that principle. Instead of seeking quick victories, it focuses on survival, retaliation, and gradual pressure. The goal is not necessarily to defeat a stronger opponent outright, but to make the conflict so costly and prolonged that the opponent eventually decides continuing the war is no longer worth the price. In game theory, this kind of strategy is sometimes described as changing the rules of the game entirely. When one side expects a short, decisive contest, and the other side prepares for a long war of attrition, the expectations of victory can quickly become illusions. The stronger side believes it is entering a contest of strength. The weaker side is actually playing a contest of patience. And patience, in the long run, can be far more powerful than strength. So when people ask whether regime change in Iran is possible, the honest answer is far more complicated than the slogans often heard in political debates. In theory, almost anything is possible in geopolitics. Governments have fallen under enormous pressure before. But when you examine the structure of the conflict, the geography, the economics, the psychology, and the history of modern warfare, a clear pattern begins to emerge. The path to regime change would require actions so costly and destabilizing that they might reshape the entire global order before achieving their intended goal, which leads to a final paradox. Sometimes, the most powerful countries in the world possess military capabilities so overwhelming that they appear unstoppable. Yet, the very complexity of the modern world creates vulnerabilities that weaker opponents can exploit. And when the stronger side enters a conflict, believing victory will be quick and decisive, while the weaker side prepares for decades of endurance, the outcome becomes far less predictable than anyone expected at the beginning. Because in the strange logic of asymmetric warfare, the side that refuses to lose can eventually become the side that wins.